In the small courthouse in Portland, Maine, what began as a routine trespassing case transformed into one of the most extraordinary moments in the building's history. No one expected that the disheveled man standing before the judge would turn out to be one of the most decorated war heroes of Operation Desert Storm, or that his revelation would reduce the entire courtroom to tears. This is the story of how a forgotten soldier's past came to light in the most unexpected way, changing not only his life, but an entire community's perspective on veterans. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter January wind howled through the narrow streets of downtown Portland, carrying with it the salty scent of the nearby harbor, mixed with the sweet aroma of fresh bread from Wilson's bakery. Tom Sullivan huddled deeper into his weathered navy peacoat, its once proud insignia now barely visible beneath years of wear. The morning frost had left a delicate pattern on the cardboard box he'd been using as a makeshift seat in the alley behind the bakery, the same spot he'd claimed as his own for the past 3 months. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, but Tom barely noticed the beauty anymore. His calloused hands, marked by scars from both war and weather, wrapped tightly around a paper cup filled with day-old coffee. A small kindness from Sarah, the young baker's apprentice, who sometimes snuck him leftover pastries before her shift began. The steam rose in delicate wisps, dancing briefly in the frigid air before disappearing, much like the life he once knew. Beside him, an old sea bag contained everything he had left in the world, a few changes of clothes, a dog-eared photo album he couldn't bear to part with, and a small metal tin containing his service papers, the last remnants of a life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing day. The rest of his possessions, including his medals and decorations, had been sold or pawned months ago, when the choice came down to pride or survival. The sound of delivery trucks backing up to the loading docks filled the morning air, accompanied by the rhythmic footsteps of early-morning commuters hurrying past the alley's entrance. To them, Tom was invisible, just another shadow in a city full of them. Some quickened their pace as they passed, clutching their designer bags closer, while others maintained the practiced indifference that city dwellers perfect over time. He had learned to recognize the subtle changes in their gaits, the slight turns of their heads, the almost choreographed dance of pretending not to see. The bakery's back door creaked open, releasing a wave of warmth and the intoxicating scent of cinnamon and yeast. Tom's stomach tightened involuntarily, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Sarah appeared briefly, her face apologetic as she quickly placed a brown paper bag near his box before disappearing back inside. She understood the delicate balance between kindness and dignity, never making him feel like a charity case. The bag contained 2 slightly imperfect croissants that wouldn't meet the bakery's exacting standards, their small flaws making them unsellable but no less delicious. As Tom reached for the bag, another figure appeared in the doorway. This time it was Mr. Wilson himself, the owner, his face set in hard lines of disapproval. Unlike his young apprentice, Wilson saw Tom's presence as a threat to his business, a blemish on the carefully cultivated image of his upscale establishment. The morning's peaceful routine was about to shatter, though Tom didn't know it yet. "This needs to end today," Wilson announced, his voice carrying the artificial patience of someone who believed they were being more than reasonable. "I've looked the other way for weeks now, but my customers are complaining. You can't stay here anymore." Tom began gathering his meager possessions with practiced efficiency, movements honed by countless similar encounters. "I understand, sir," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of military discipline that never quite left him, even after all these years. "I'll move along." But Wilson wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the keypad. No, this time I'm making sure you don't come back. I'm calling the police." The word police hung in the air like frost, and Tom felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had managed to avoid serious trouble since becoming homeless, maintaining a low profile and always moving along when asked. But something was different today. Whether it was the cold, the hunger, or simply the accumulated weight of countless similar rejections, he found himself rooted to the spot. The sound of Wilson punching in the numbers echoed off the alley walls, each digit bringing Tom closer to a confrontation he'd tried so hard to avoid. As he finally stood, his joints protesting against the cold, he caught his reflection in a window, a ghost of the man he once was, when his uniform commanded respect instead of suspicion, when his presence inspired confidence rather than discomfort. Little did Tom Sullivan know, as he heard Wilson speaking to the police dispatcher, that this moment, this seemingly routine ejection from yet another temporary refuge, would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change his life, but would force an entire community to confront its treatment of those who had sacrificed everything in service to their country. Officer Michael Chen pulled his patrol car to a stop at the entrance of the alley behind Wilson's bakery, his breath visible in the cold morning air as he stepped out onto the frost-covered pavement. In his 8 years on the Portland police force, he had handled countless similar calls, business owners wanting homeless individuals removed from their property. Most ended peacefully, though each one left him with a growing sense of futility about the system's inability to provide real solutions. Through the steam rising from the bakery's vents, he could see the subject of the complaint. A man in his 50s, wearing a worn navy peacoat, methodically packing what appeared to be his only possessions into an old sea bag. There was something about his movements that caught Chen's attention, a precision and dignity that seemed at odds with his current circumstances. The officer approached slowly, conscious of how his uniform and badge might be perceived. "Good morning, sir," Chen called out, maintaining a professional but non-threatening tone. "I received a call about a disturbance." He noticed how the man straightened almost imperceptibly at his approach, shoulders squaring in what appeared to be an instinctive response to authority. Mr. Wilson emerged from the bakery's back door, wiping his hands on his flour-dusted apron. "Officer, thank you for coming quickly. This man has been loitering here for weeks. He's driving away customers, and I've had enough." The baker's voice carried the edge of someone who believed they were protecting their livelihood. Tom Sullivan stood quietly, his sea bag now packed and held close. "No disturbance, officer," he said, his voice carrying a hint of what Chen recognized as military bearing. "I was just leaving." A young woman appeared briefly in the bakery doorway behind Wilson, her face etched with concern before her employer shooed her back inside. Chen observed the scene carefully, noting the brown paper bag of pastries on the ground, the relatively clean area around where the man had been sitting, and the complete absence of any signs of actual disturbance. This wasn't the typical situation of aggressive panhandling or disorderly conduct that often prompted such calls. "Sir, could I see some identification?" Chen asked, following procedure while maintaining a respectful tone. He watched as Sullivan reached into his sea bag with deliberate movements, producing a worn wallet. The leather was cracked and faded, but the military ID card he pulled from it was carefully preserved, protected by a clear plastic sleeve. "Thomas Sullivan, sir," he said, handing over the ID. "Former Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy." The military title was stated without pride or emphasis, just a simple fact, like the color of the sky or the chill in the air. Chen examined the ID, noting the service dates and the man's former status. Something about Sullivan's demeanor made him hesitate before following the usual protocol of simply moving him along. "Mr. Sullivan, have you been in contact with the Veterans Services Office here in Portland?" Before Tom could answer, Wilson interjected, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Officer, I don't mean to be difficult, but I have a business to run. Whether he's a veteran or not, he can't stay here. My customers shouldn't have to walk past this every morning." The word "this" hung in the air like an accusation, and Chen noticed Sullivan's jaw tighten slightly, though his expression remained neutral. The officer found himself caught between procedure and conscience, between the letter of the law and its spirit. "Mr. Sullivan," Chen began, choosing his words carefully, "while Mr. Wilson has the right to ask you to leave his property, I'd like to help connect you with some local resources. We have a veterans outreach program that might be able to—" "With all due respect, officer," Sullivan interrupted quietly, "I've been down that road. The waiting lists are long, and the paperwork—" He trailed off, leaving unspoken the bureaucratic maze that had already defeated him countless times. "I'll move along. No need to complicate things." As Sullivan bent to pick up his bag, Chen noticed a slight tremor in his hands, not from fear or substance abuse, but something else. The morning light caught the man's face, revealing scars near his temple that disappeared into his graying hairline. There was a story there, Chen was certain, but before he could inquire further, Wilson spoke again. "Officer, I need to insist on pressing charges for trespassing. If I don't take a formal stand, he'll just keep coming back." The baker's voice had hardened, his initial frustration crystallizing into determination. "I've given plenty of warnings. Enough is enough." Chen felt the situation shifting, options narrowing. He had hoped to resolve this informally, but Wilson's insistence on pressing charges changed everything. Protocol now required him to act, regardless of his personal feelings about the situation. "Mr. Sullivan," Chen said, regret evident in his voice, "I'm afraid if Mr. Wilson wants to press charges, I'll need you to come with me to the station." He watched as Sullivan absorbed this news, noting how the man's military bearing seemed to intensify rather than crumble, as if adversity awakened some deep-rooted training. "I understand, officer," Sullivan replied, his voice steady. "May I secure my belongings first?" The formality of the request, the inherent dignity in the face of humiliation, made Chen's next words even harder to deliver. "I'll need to search your bag first, sir. Standard procedure." Chen waited for protest or resistance, but Sullivan simply nodded, carefully placing his sea bag on a dry patch of ground and stepping back. As Chen began his search, he couldn't shake the feeling that this particular morning was about to become anything but routine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The police cruiser's heater hummed softly as Officer Chen navigated through Portland's morning traffic. In the rearview mirror, he could see Thomas Sullivan sitting quietly in the back seat, his weathered face illuminated by the passing streetlights. The sea bag, carefully searched and documented, rested in the trunk. Through the windshield, early morning fog rolled in from the harbor, shrouding the city's buildings in the ethereal haze that seemed to isolate their journey from the awakening world around them. Chen found himself breaking protocol slightly, choosing to fill the silence rather than maintain the professional distance typically expected during transport. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "I noticed your service dates included Operation Desert Storm." He paused, watching Sullivan's reflection for any reaction. "My father served during that time, 3rd Marine Division." Sullivan's eyes met Chen's in the mirror briefly before returning to their steady gaze out the window. "Good outfit," he responded, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "I was attached to Naval Special Warfare Group 2. We provided maritime support for various operations." The words were measured, precise, revealing just enough to acknowledge the connection while maintaining the barriers that years of hardship had built. As they waited at a red light, a group of office workers crossed in front of them, clutching coffee cups and briefcases, hurrying toward another day of normalcy. Sullivan watched them with an expression that spoke of a deep disconnection from their reality. "You know, officer," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, "sometimes I look at them and wonder if they know how fragile it all is. One moment you're serving your country, the next." He left the thought unfinished, but its completion hung heavy in the air. Chen turned onto Cumberland Avenue, the courthouse and police station now visible through the morning mist. "The system's supposed to prevent veterans from ending up in situations like this," he said, unable to keep a trace of frustration from his voice. "There are programs, resources." "Programs," Sullivan interrupted, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, there are programs, forms to fill out, waiting lists to join, appointments to keep. But when the nightmares come at 3 a.m., when the memories hit so hard you can't breathe, when your mind won't stop replaying moments you've spent decades trying to forget, those programs feel very far away." The raw honesty of his words filled the car's interior, making the space between them feel both vast and intimate. Chen found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter, thinking of his father's occasional distant looks, the conversations that would stop when he entered a room as a child, the photos that stayed forever in albums, never opened. As they pulled into the station's parking area, Sullivan spoke again, his voice taking on a formal tone that seemed to be his way of maintaining dignity in difficult situations. "I appreciate your courtesy during this transport, Officer Chen. I want you to know that I understand you're doing your job. No hard feelings about any of this." Chen parked the cruiser and turned to look directly at Sullivan. "Sir, before we go in, I want you to know something. I'm required to process this arrest, but I'm also going to make some calls. There are people who might be able to help, people who work specifically with veterans in situations like yours." Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps hope, perhaps merely resignation dressed up as politeness. "That's kind of you, officer. But I've learned not to expect too much. Makes disappointment easier to handle." The booking process began with its usual efficiency. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork. Sullivan stood straight during his booking photo, his military bearing evident even in this moment of personal indignity. The charge was simple: criminal trespassing, a misdemeanor that would normally be processed quickly and result in either a fine or a short jail stay. But as Chen watched Sullivan being processed, noting how the veteran maintained his composure even as his few possessions were catalogued and placed in a property bag, he felt an increasing sense that this case needed to be handled differently. During the search, they had found Sullivan's service records in that metal tin, documents that hinted at a history far more complex than that of a simple trespassing case. The booking officer, a sergeant nearing retirement age, noticed it too. After taking Sullivan's fingerprints, he paused, studying the man's face. "You look familiar," he said slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Were you ever stationed at Naval Station Newport?" Sullivan nodded slightly. "Training instructor, 94 to 96, before my last deployment." The sergeant's eyes widened slightly, a glimmer of recognition crossing his face. But before he could speak further, Sullivan was led away to holding, his sea bag and its contents secured in property storage. Chen completed his report with meticulous detail, making sure to note Sullivan's military service and current circumstances. As he filed the paperwork, he made a decision that would prove to be pivotal in the events to come. Instead of processing this as a routine trespassing case, he attached a special notice, requesting the court consider Sullivan's veteran status and suggesting evaluation for the Veterans Treatment Court program. What Chen couldn't know, as he watched Sullivan being led to the holding cell, was that his small act of compassion, that extra notation in an otherwise routine report, would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only Sullivan's life, but the lives of countless others in their community. The real story was about to begin, not in the cold confines of a jail cell, but in a courtroom where truth and justice would find an unexpected intersection. The holding cell at the Portland police station maintained a temperature that seemed deliberately calibrated to prevent comfort. Thomas Sullivan sat on the metal bench, his back straight against the concrete wall, hands folded in his lap with military precision. The cell's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, highlighting every line earned through years of service and subsequent hardship. The institutional silence was broken only by the distant sounds of officers going about their duties and the occasional echo of doors closing throughout the facility. Through the cell's reinforced glass window, Sullivan could see the station's booking area, where Officer Chen was completing paperwork at his desk. The young officer's earlier kindness had stirred something in Sullivan that he'd worked hard to suppress over the years: hope. He watched as Chen occasionally glanced in his direction, the officer's face showing signs of internal conflict as he worked through the documentation. Sullivan's thoughts drifted to the contents of his sea bag, now secured in property storage. The metal tin containing his service records held more than just papers. It contained evidence of a life that seemed increasingly distant with each passing day. His fingers unconsciously traced the outline of where his Navy Cross would have rested against his chest had he not been forced to sell it 6 months ago, when the choice came down to eating or maintaining that symbol of valor. The booking sergeant, the one who had recognized something familiar about him, passed by the cell again, this time slower than necessary. Sullivan could see the man was struggling with a memory, trying to place a face from decades ago in a different context. The sergeant's recognition had triggered Sullivan's own memories of his time as a training instructor at Newport, days when his uniform was pressed, his authority unquestioned, and his future seemed secure. A young deputy arrived with a sandwich and a paper cup of water, sliding them through the cell's food slot. "Compliments of Officer Chen," she said, her voice carrying a note of respect that felt foreign after months of being treated as invisible. Sullivan accepted the food with a quiet "thank you," noting how the deputy's manner toward him differed from the usual procedural indifference shown to those in holding. As he ate, Sullivan observed the station's routine unfold before him. New arrests arrived, paperwork was processed, phones rang with their endless demands for attention. He recognized the orchestrated chaos of an organization dedicated to maintaining order. It reminded him of his days on naval vessels, where every action served a purpose within a larger mission. The sandwich wasn't much, but it was the first proper meal he'd had in days. Each bite brought back memories of mess halls and shared meals with his unit. He thought about his team from Special Warfare Group 2, wondering how many of them knew he'd ended up here. The shame of his current situation had kept him from reaching out to old contacts, even when things were at their worst. Through the window, Sullivan noticed Officer Chen engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation. The officer's gestures and expression suggested he was advocating for something, occasionally pointing toward the holding cell while speaking. Sullivan had seen enough bureaucratic negotiations during his service to recognize when someone was fighting against institutional inertia. A new shift of officers arrived, bringing with them the energy change that accompanied any transition of authority. Sullivan watched as Chen briefed his replacement, the two officers occasionally glancing in his direction. The younger officer's demeanor suggested he wasn't simply handing over a routine case. He was investing personal concern in its outcome. As the afternoon wore on, Sullivan's military training helped him maintain his composure, but his mind wandered to the upcoming court appearance. He had stood before authority many times in his life, from military tribunals to Veterans Affairs offices, but something about this situation felt different, Perhaps it was Officer Chen's unexpected advocacy, or the booking sergeant's flash of recognition, or simply the culmination of too many months living on society's margins. The cell's clock ticked steadily toward evening, each minute bringing him closer to a courtroom where he would have to account for his presence behind Wilson's bakery. Sullivan knew the charge was minor. Criminal trespassing rarely resulted in significant penalties, but he also understood that his lack of fixed address would complicate any resolution. The system wasn't designed to process people without somewhere to go. Just before the end of his shift, Officer Chen appeared at the cell door. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice low and professional, "I've spoken with the court administrator. Your hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9. I've also made some calls to veterans advocacy groups. There's someone who wants to speak with you before the hearing." The officer hesitated before adding, "Sir, I think tomorrow might be different from what you're expecting." Sullivan nodded, maintaining his composed exterior while internally processing the officer's words. Years of military service had taught him to prepare for any scenario, but hope was a luxury he'd learned to live without. Still, something in Chen's tone suggested possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider in a very long time. As darkness fell outside and the station's rhythm shifted to its night cycle, Sullivan settled into the practiced stillness that had served him through countless watches and missions. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, in this cell with its unyielding bench and harsh lighting, he was at least warm, fed, and for the first time in months, the subject of someone's genuine concern. The night before his court appearance, Thomas Sullivan lay awake on the holding cell's bench, watching shadows from passing patrol cars dance across the ceiling. The station had settled into its nighttime rhythm, punctuated by the occasional crackle of radio dispatches and the measured footsteps of officers on their rounds. Each sound echoed through the corridors, bringing with it memories of night watches aboard naval vessels, where the hum of machinery and the distant sound of waves had once been his constant companions. Earlier that evening, a visitor had arrived, a woman named Patricia Martinez from the Veterans Legal Advocacy Group. Officer Chen had arranged the meeting before ending his shift. Martinez, with her precisely pressed pantsuit and leather briefcase, represented a world Sullivan had long since left behind. She had listened intently as he shared the bare outline of his circumstances, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad as she documented his service history and the series of events that had led him to that holding cell. "Mr. Sullivan," she had said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to navigating bureaucratic mazes, "your service record indicates several commendations that aren't typically associated with routine naval operations. Would you be willing to discuss your role during Operation Desert Storm?" The question had hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Sullivan had shifted uncomfortably on the metal bench, his fingers unconsciously tracing the scar near his temple, a souvenir from a mission he'd spent decades trying to forget. "Ma'am," he had replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "some things are better left in the past." Martinez had noted his response with a slight nod, but Sullivan could see the curiosity in her eyes. She knew there was more to his story than he was willing to share. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, Sullivan found his thoughts drifting to the mission that had earned him the Navy Cross, the medal he'd been forced to sell. The operation had been classified at the time, and even now, decades later, certain details remained sealed. But the weight of that bronze medallion had represented more than just military decoration. It had been a tangible reminder that his service had mattered, that his sacrifices had meant something. The night brought with it the memories he worked so hard to suppress during daylight hours. The face of Lieutenant James Cooper surfaced in his mind, young, eager, full of potential, before disappearing beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf during a covert extraction operation. Sullivan had earned his medal bringing Cooper's body home, but the cost had been paid in nightmares that still haunted him 30 years later. A new officer passed by his cell, this one younger than Chen, probably born after Desert Storm had ended. The officer's crisp uniform and alert posture reminded Sullivan of his own early days in service, before experience had taught him that not all battles leave visible scars. The young officer paused briefly, perhaps noting how Sullivan sat with military straightness even at this late hour, before continuing his rounds. Through the cell's window, Sullivan could see the first hints of pre-dawn light beginning to color the eastern sky. In a few hours, he would stand before a judge to answer for the crime of trying to find shelter behind a bakery. The irony wasn't lost on him. How a man who had once commanded special operations teams was now considered a nuisance to be cleared from public view. Martinez had left him with a business card and a promise to be present at his hearing. "Your story needs to be told, Mr. Sullivan," she had said as she gathered her materials. "The court needs to understand that you're not just another homeless defendant. You're a decorated veteran who's been failed by the very system you fought to protect." Sullivan had accepted her card with polite thanks, but inside he questioned whether anyone would truly care about his past achievements. In his experience, the world had little use for old soldiers once their wars were over. The medals and commendations that had once opened doors now gathered dust in pawn shops or private collections, sold to cover basic necessities when his veterans' benefits had become tangled in administrative delays. As the night deepened, Sullivan found himself mentally preparing for court as he once had for missions. He reviewed the facts of his case, considering possible outcomes and contingencies. The military had taught him to always have a plan, to anticipate variables, to maintain situational awareness. But this situation felt different from anything his training had prepared him for. Officer Chen's parting words echoed in his mind. "Tomorrow might be different from what you're expecting." Sullivan had learned long ago not to place too much faith in promises of help or change. Yet something about the young officer's earnest determination, combined with Martinez's professional interest in his case, had planted a tiny seed of hope. Dangerous territory for a man who had learned that expectations often led to disappointment. The facility's heating system hummed to life, pushing warm air through the vents in preparation for the morning shift. Sullivan closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to center himself. Tomorrow he would face judgment, not just for a minor trespassing charge, but for the culmination of choices and circumstances that had led him to this moment. As he had done countless times before missions, he focused on controlling what he could and accepting what he couldn't. Dawn was approaching, and with it would come a day that would prove to be far more significant than anyone in the Portland courthouse could possibly anticipate. The Cumberland County Courthouse stood as an imposing testament to justice, its granite facade catching the early morning sunlight. The January air remained bitter as Thomas Sullivan, escorted by a court officer, made his way up the worn stone steps. His military training was evident in his bearing. Despite his circumstances, he maintained the posture of a man accustomed to facing scrutiny with dignity. The courthouse's historic entrance hall, with its marble columns and vaulted ceiling, created an atmosphere of austere authority. Early morning light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Court employees moved purposefully through security checkpoints, their heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that echoed through the space. Sullivan observed everything with the heightened awareness that had once kept him alive in combat zones. Patricia Martinez waited near the security checkpoint, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to the mixed crowd of defendants, attorneys, and court staff filing through the metal detectors. She approached Sullivan with purpose, her briefcase containing the notes from their late-night discussion. "Mr. Sullivan," she greeted him, her voice low but firm, "I've reviewed your case file thoroughly, and there are several aspects I believe the court needs to consider." The security screening process provided a moment of unintended theatre. As Sullivan passed through the metal detector, the machine remained silent, a small detail that didn't escape the notice of the security officers. One of them, an older man with a veteran's pin on his uniform lapel, studied Sullivan's movements with quiet recognition. Military men often recognize their own, even years removed from service. In the corridor outside Courtroom 3, Martinez reviewed their strategy. "The judge assigned to your case is the Honorable Eleanor Richardson," she explained, consulting her tablet. "She has a reputation for being thorough and fair, particularly in cases involving veterans." Sullivan nodded, though his expression suggested limited faith in any system's ability to understand his situation. The courthouse's morning routine unfolded around them. Lawyers hurried past with briefcases and tablets, their suits marking them as regular players in this theatre of justice. Defendants arrived in various states of preparation and anxiety, some accompanied by family, others facing their moments of judgment alone. Sullivan observed it all with the detached awareness of someone who had seen far more challenging situations. Officer Chen appeared, now in his formal court uniform rather than patrol gear. He approached Sullivan and Martinez, his manner professional, but carrying an undercurrent of genuine concern. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "I've spoken with the court clerk. They're aware of your service record." He hesitated before adding, "Sir, I think it's important that the judge hears your full story." Sullivan's response was measured, his voice carrying the weight of years of institutional disappointment. "Officer Chen, I appreciate your concern, but in my experience the past doesn't carry much weight in present circumstances." Martinez exchanged a glance with Chen, both recognizing the challenge of helping someone who had learned to expect the worst. As they waited, a young journalist from the Portland Press-Herald settled into a bench nearby, laptop open and ready. The morning docket typically didn't warrant media coverage, but something, perhaps Officer Chen's calls or Martinez's involvement, had caught the paper's attention. The reporter observed Sullivan with professional curiosity, noting the military bearing that contrasted with his worn clothing. Through the courtroom's heavy wooden doors, they could hear the morning session beginning. The court officer appeared, clipboard in hand, calling out names and organizing the day's proceedings. Sullivan stood slightly straighter, if that was possible, his hands clasped behind his back in parade rest, a posture so ingrained it had survived years of civilian life and hardship. Martinez took advantage of these final moments to make one last attempt at convincing Sullivan to be more forthcoming. "The court needs to understand the full context of your service," she urged quietly. "Your actions during Desert Storm, the Navy Cross, these aren't just decorations, they're evidence of character." Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes at the mention of his military honors. The court officer appeared again, this time looking directly at their group. "Commonwealth versus Sullivan," he announced, "Judge Richardson's courtroom." As they moved toward the doors, Officer Chen stepped forward. "I'll be staying for this," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a casual interest in the outcome of his arrest. The heavy doors opened, revealing the formal architecture of justice, the polished wooden barriers, the state flag beside the bench, the rows of spectator seating that would soon bear witness to whatever was about to unfold. Sullivan paused for just a moment at the threshold, his military training warring with his instinct to retreat from public scrutiny. What happened next would transform not only Sullivan's life, but the very nature of how his community viewed its obligations to those who had served. The stage was set for a morning of revelations that would ripple far beyond the confines of Courtroom 3. The atmosphere in Courtroom 3 of the Cumberland County Courthouse carried the weight of institutional authority. Judge Eleanor Richardson presided from her elevated bench, her silver hair pulled back in a precise bun, her black robes settling around her with practiced dignity. The morning sunlight filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the polished wooden barriers that separated the gallery from the proceedings. As Thomas Sullivan took his place at the defendant's table alongside Patricia Martinez, the usual morning bustle of the courtroom settled into attentive silence. The court clerk, a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses perched on her nose, began the formal proceedings with practiced efficiency. Docket number 2024, CR 157, Commonwealth versus Thomas Sullivan, charged with criminal trespassing, a misdemeanor under State Statute 266. 120, the clerk announced, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's perfect acoustics. The routine nature of her words belied the unusual attention this case had drawn. Judge Richardson studied the papers before her, her expression thoughtful as she reviewed the details of the case. Her reputation for thoroughness was immediately evident in the deliberate way she examined each document, occasionally making small notations in the margin with a silver fountain pen. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Richardson began, her voice carrying both authority and an unexpected note of curiosity, "I see here that Officer Chen has made some rather unusual notations in his arrest report. Before we proceed with the formal charges, I'd like to address these points." She adjusted her reading glasses, lifting a page from the file. "The report indicates you have a military background that may be relevant to these proceedings." Martinez rose smoothly from her chair. "Your Honor, if I may, I'm Patricia Martinez from the Veterans Legal Advocacy Group. We would like to provide the court with some context regarding Mr. Sullivan's service record and current circumstances." The judge nodded her permission, and Martinez proceeded with careful precision. "Mr. Sullivan served with distinction in the United States Navy, specifically with Naval Special Warfare Group 2 during Operation Desert Storm. His service record includes—" Martinez paused, glancing at Sullivan, who sat with rigid military posture, his eyes fixed forward. "Your Honor, my client's full service record includes details that were, at the time, classified. We believe these details are pertinent to understanding the circumstances that led to his current situation." From his position in the gallery, Officer Chen watched intently. The young journalist from the Portland Press-Herald had positioned herself near the front, her laptop open but her fingers still, caught up in the unfolding scene. Mr. Wilson, the baker who had initiated the complaint, sat near the back, his expression shifting between impatience and growing curiosity. Judge Richardson leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. "Mr. Sullivan, would you please rise?" Sullivan stood with fluid precision, his military bearing impossible to disguise despite his worn clothing. "Sir, are you comfortable with Ms. Martinez sharing the details of your service record with this court?" Sullivan's response came with measured control. "Your Honor, some aspects of my service remain sensitive, even after all these years. However," he paused, glancing briefly at Officer Chen, "I understand the court needs a complete picture to make its determination." The judge studied Sullivan for a moment, her expression suggesting she recognized something in his demeanor that went beyond the usual defendants who appeared before her. "Ms. Martinez, please proceed with any unclassified information you believe is relevant to these proceedings." Martinez opened a folder on the table, removing several authenticated documents. "Your Honor, in 1991, then Petty Officer First Class Sullivan was involved in a critical operation in the Persian Gulf. While much of the operation remains classified, what is public record is that his actions saved the lives of 17 servicemen, including—" She paused, checking her notes. "Including recovering fallen comrades under heavy fire, an action for which he was awarded the Navy Cross." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor in recognition of valor, was not a decoration awarded lightly. Judge Richardson raised her hand slightly, silencing the gallery. Mr. Sullivan, is this correct? Yes, Your Honor. Sullivan's voice remained steady, though those closest to him might have noticed a slight tension in his jaw. Though I no longer possess the medal itself. You no longer possess it? The judge's question carried a note of concern. Could you explain why? Indeed, the silence that followed seemed to expand, filling the courtroom with its weight. Sullivan stood perfectly still, his military training evident in his rigid posture, but something in his expression suggested an internal struggle. When he finally spoke, his words carried the heavy burden of dignity under duress. Your Honor, 6 months ago, I had to make a choice between keeping the medal and eating. I chose to eat. The simplicity of his statement, delivered without self-pity or drama, seemed to strip away the formal veneer of the courtroom, revealing the raw humanity beneath the legal proceedings. Judge Richardson removed her reading glasses, her expression suggesting that the routine trespassing case before her had just transformed into something far more significant. Ms. Martinez, I believe we need to hear Mr. Sullivan's full story. Please continue. Patricia Martinez rose from her chair with deliberate composure, holding a document bearing the official seal of the Department of the Navy. The morning light streaming through the courtroom windows highlighted the subtle tremor in her hands as she prepared to reveal information that would transform the proceedings. The weight of this moment was evident in the careful way she arranged her papers, ensuring every detail would be presented with the precision it deserved. Your Honor, Martinez began, her voice clear and measured, what I'm about to share has only recently been declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. She glanced at Sullivan, who maintained his rigid posture, though a muscle twitched almost imperceptibly in his jaw. On February 24, 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, Petty Officer First Class Sullivan was serving as part of a classified maritime operation in the Persian Gulf when his unit received distress signals from a downed helicopter carrying a high-value intelligence team. Judge Richardson leaned forward slightly, her silver pen poised above her notepad. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the gentle hum of the heating system seemed intrusive. Even Mr. Wilson, who had been checking his watch repeatedly, now sat forward with evident interest. The helicopter had gone down in hostile waters, Martinez continued, in an area heavily monitored by enemy radar installations. Standard protocol would have demanded waiting for additional support before attempting rescue operations. However, the intelligence team was carrying crucial information about enemy chemical weapons facilities. They needed immediate extraction. Sullivan's hands, clasped behind his back, tightened noticeably. The young journalist from the Portland Press-Herald typed rapidly on her laptop, her eyes darting between Martinez and Sullivan as the story unfolded. Mr. Sullivan, then leading a 4-man team, made the decision to proceed with an immediate rescue attempt. Their small craft approached under cover of darkness, navigating through waters that were likely mined. Upon reaching the crash site, they found the helicopter partially submerged, with 3 survivors and 4 casualties. Enemy patrol boats had already been alerted to the crash. Martinez paused, allowing the gravity of the situation to register with the court. Judge Richardson had set down her pen, her full attention focused on the unfolding narrative. Officer Chen, still present in the gallery, watched Sullivan's face intently, noting how the veteran's expression remained carefully controlled despite the mounting tension. What happened next, Your Honor, is documented in multiple after-action reports, though the details remained classified until recently. As enemy searchlights began sweeping the water, Sullivan ordered his team to begin extraction of the survivors and the crucial intelligence materials. However, he refused to leave the site until all bodies were recovered, including that of Lieutenant James Cooper, the intelligence team's leader. At the mention of Cooper's name, Sullivan's composure wavered slightly. It was a subtle change that most might have missed, but Judge Richardson, watching carefully, noted the momentary breach in his military bearing. Under intense enemy fire, Sullivan personally recovered Lieutenant Cooper's body, ensuring no American would be left behind. The action exposed him to direct fire, resulting in injuries including the scar still visible near his temple. His team successfully extracted all personnel, living and deceased, along with the crucial intelligence data. The information recovered that night led directly to the identification and subsequent neutralization of 3 chemical weapons facilities. Martinez lifted another document. The citation for his Navy Cross reads, in part, "Petty Officer Sullivan's exceptional valor, unwavering dedication to his fallen comrades, and complete disregard for his own safety reflected great credit upon himself and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." The courtroom remained silent as Martinez paused, allowing the weight of Sullivan's actions to settle over the proceedings. Judge Richardson studied Sullivan with new understanding, noting how he stood at perfect attention despite the obvious discomfort of having his past exposed. "Your Honor," Martinez continued, her voice softening slightly, "what isn't mentioned in the citation is that Lieutenant Cooper left behind a pregnant wife. Thanks to Mr. Sullivan's actions, she was able to bury her husband with full military honors. Their daughter, now a naval officer herself, grew up knowing her father died serving his country and was brought home by a hero who refused to leave him behind." The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. Mr. Wilson, who had initiated the trespassing complaint, sat back in his seat, his expression transformed from impatience to something approaching shame. The young journalist had stopped typing, her hands frozen above her keyboard as she processed the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Judge Richardson removed her reading glasses, taking a moment to compose herself before speaking. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying a new note of respect, "would you be willing to tell this court what happened after your return from service? How did a decorated veteran with such a distinguished record end up sleeping in an alley behind a bakery?" Judge Eleanor Richardson listened intently as Thomas Sullivan began to explain his post-service journey, but something about Lieutenant Cooper's name had stirred a memory she couldn't immediately place. She studied the veteran standing before her with increasing attention, her judicial objectivity temporarily wrestling with a growing sense of recognition. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, his voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken struggles, "the transition back to civilian life was—" He paused, searching for words that could bridge the gap between military precision and civilian understanding. It was like trying to speak a language I'd forgotten. The skills that kept us alive in combat didn't translate well to civilian job applications. The judge's hand moved to a small photograph she kept on her bench, normally hidden from view behind her nameplate. Her movement caught Sullivan's attention, and he fell silent as she lifted the frame with trembling fingers. The courtroom remained still, sensing the gravity of the moment even without understanding its cause. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Richardson spoke, her usual judicial detachment giving way to something more personal, "you mentioned Lieutenant James Cooper." She held the photograph in both hands now, her eyes moving between it and Sullivan's face. "James Cooper was my brother." The revelation sent a palpable shock through the courtroom. The young journalist's fingers froze above her keyboard. Officer Chen straightened in his seat, while Patricia Martinez quietly placed a steadying hand on Sullivan's arm. Even Mr. Wilson, still seated in the back, leaned forward to better hear what would come next. "Your Honor, Sullivan's military composure wavered for the first time since entering the courtroom. "I didn't know. The lieutenant, your brother, he was a good man." His voice carried the weight of memories he'd carried alone for decades. Judge Richardson stood, an unusual break in courtroom protocol that emphasized the extraordinary nature of the moment. For 30 years, our family knew only that James died serving his country and that one of his fellow servicemen had risked everything to bring him home. She placed the photograph on her bench, visible now to those in the courtroom, a young naval officer in dress whites, smiling with the confidence of youth. That serviceman was never named in the reports we received. The mission was classified. But my niece, James's daughter, grew up knowing that somewhere out there was the man who made sure her father came home. The silence in the courtroom grew deeper, if that was possible. Martinez stood quietly, understanding that this moment transcended legal proceedings. Sullivan remained at attention, but tears now rolled freely down his weathered cheeks. "Kate," Judge Richardson continued, her voice softening as she spoke of her niece, "followed in her father's footsteps. She serves in the Navy now, and every Memorial Day she places flowers on her father's grave. We were able to have a funeral, to have closure, to have a place to remember him. Because of you, Mr. Sullivan." The judge stepped down from her bench, another breach of protocol that her clerk noted but didn't challenge. She approached the defendant's table, carrying both her brother's photograph and a tissue she'd taken from her desk. "When I received this case file this morning, I had no idea." She composed herself, years of judicial training, helping her maintain professional dignity even as she dealt with profound personal emotions. "The man who brought my brother home shouldn't be sleeping in alleys or selling his medals to eat." Sullivan struggled to maintain his military bearing, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, Lieutenant Cooper earned my actions that day through his own sacrifice. I merely fulfilled my duty to a fellow serviceman." "Your duty?" Judge Richardson's question carried both judicial authority and sisterly grief. "Mr. Sullivan, you went above and beyond duty. You risked your life under enemy fire to bring my brother's body home. Our mother got to say goodbye. His wife got to lay flowers at a real grave. His daughter got to grow up knowing her father was honored in death as in life." She paused, collecting herself. "And now I find you in my courtroom, charged with trespassing because you had nowhere else to go." The young journalist had stopped taking notes entirely, caught up in the human drama unfolding before her. Officer Chen sat forward in his seat, his own military background helping him understand the profound significance of this reunion. Mr. Wilson had removed his baker's cap, holding it respectfully in his hands as he witnessed the scene. Judge Richardson returned to her bench, carefully replacing her brother's photograph. When she spoke again, her voice carried both judicial authority and personal conviction. "This court finds itself in an unprecedented situation. The charges before us seem insignificant compared to the debt we owe you, Mr. Sullivan, but more importantly, they represent a failure. Our failure as a society to honor our commitments to those who serve." Judge Richardson composed herself, adjusting her robes as she prepared to address an aspect of the case that clearly troubled her. The morning light had strengthened, casting the courtroom in a warm glow that contrasted with the gravity of the proceedings. She lifted another document from her bench, this one bearing the distinctive seal of the Navy Department. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice carrying the dual weight of judicial authority and personal concern, "you mentioned earlier that you no longer possess your Navy Cross. The court would like to understand the circumstances that led to parting with such a significant recognition of valor." Sullivan stood at attention, his posture reflecting years of military discipline, even as discomfort flickered across his features. "Your Honor, last August, during a particularly difficult period, I found myself facing a choice between basic necessities and maintaining possession of the medal. A private collector had expressed interest, offering enough to secure food and shelter for several months." Patricia Martinez interjected carefully, "Your Honor, if I may provide context, The waiting period for veterans' benefits appeals can extend beyond 6 months, and Mr. Sullivan's case had encountered several administrative delays. During this time, he received no support despite his documented service-connected disabilities. The judge nodded, making a notation in her files. "Mr. Sullivan, could you tell the court the name of this collector?" Her question carried a note of purpose that suggested more than mere curiosity. "Gerald Whitman, Your Honor. He operates an upscale military memorabilia shop in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood." Sullivan's voice remained steady, but his hands, still clasped behind his back, tightened visibly. He offered $4,000. At the time, it seemed like the only option. From his position in the gallery, Officer Chen watched the proceedings with growing interest. His earlier calls to veteran advocacy groups had set several wheels in motion, though Sullivan remained unaware of these developments. The young journalist from the Portland Press-Herald had begun typing again, her fingers moving rapidly across her keyboard as she documented every detail. Judge Richardson removed her reading glasses, placing them deliberately on her bench. $4,000, she repeated, her tone suggesting she was weighing something in her mind. "For a Navy Cross awarded for an action that brought my brother home." The personal note in her voice caused Sullivan to glance up, meeting her gaze for the first time since the revelation of their connection. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, his composure finally cracking slightly, "selling that medal was the hardest decision I've ever made. Not because of what it represented for me, but because of what it represented for Lieutenant Cooper and the others. They deserve better than having their sacrifice end up in a collector's display case." The judge lifted another document, this one clearly more recent than the others. "Mr. Sullivan, are you aware that the Navy Cross is considered property of the United States government, that its sale is technically prohibited by federal law?" Sullivan's face paled slightly, but before he could respond, Martinez rose smoothly to her feet. "Your Honor, if I may address this point. While technically correct, the law has rarely been enforced in cases where veterans facing dire circumstances have been compelled to sell their decorations. Moreover, I would argue that the circumstances leading to the sale represent a broader systemic failure that the court should consider." Judge Richardson held up a hand, silencing further legal argument. "Ms. Martinez, your point is noted. However, I raise this issue not to add to Mr. Sullivan's legal complications, but because it provides this court with an interesting opportunity." She turned her attention back to Sullivan. "Sir, would you accept a replacement medal if one could be arranged?" The question seemed to catch Sullivan off guard. His military bearing wavered as he processed its implications. "Your Honor, I'm not sure I deserve a replacement. The original was awarded for bringing Lieutenant Cooper home. Selling it, regardless of the circumstances, dishonored that mission." The judge's expression softened. "Mr. Sullivan, my brother's daughter, your lieutenant's daughter, is currently stationed at the Pentagon. This morning, while this court was in session, she was notified of these proceedings. She has already initiated the paperwork for a replacement medal to be issued." She paused, allowing the information to sink in. "She believes, as I do, that the true dishonor lies not in your actions, but in a system that forced a decorated veteran to choose between his medals and his meals." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Mr. Wilson, still clutching his baker's cap, had tears in his eyes. The journalist had stopped typing entirely, caught up in the emotional weight of the moment. Officer Chen sat with a slight smile, knowing his early morning calls had helped set these events in motion. "Furthermore," Judge Richardson continued, her judicial tone returning, "I have here a receipt from Whitman's Militaria in Boston, dated this morning. The original Navy Cross has been repurchased by a foundation that specializes in returning military decorations to veterans or their families. They will be delivering it to Lieutenant Cooper's daughter, who has expressed her wish that you accept both medals, the original and its replacement, as a testament to your service and sacrifice." Judge Eleanor Richardson straightened the papers before her with deliberate precision, her movements measured and purposeful as she prepared to deliver her ruling. The morning had transformed what should have been a routine trespassing case into something far more significant, and she understood that her next words would carry weight far beyond the confines of Courtroom 3. "Before this court renders its decision," she began, her voice carrying the full authority of her position, "I want to address several matters that have come to light during these proceedings. First, regarding the criminal complaint before us. Mr. Wilson," she directed her attention to the baker, still seated in the gallery, "do you wish to maintain your complaint against Mr. Sullivan?" Mr. Wilson stood quickly, his baker's cap still clutched in his hands. "No, Your Honor. I withdraw my complaint completely, and if I may say something—" At the judge's nod, he turned to face Sullivan. "Sir, I had no idea. I'm deeply sorry. My father served in Vietnam, and he always taught me to respect veterans. I failed to live up to that today. My bakery will always be open to you, not just the alley, but inside where it's warm. You'll never go hungry there again." Judge Richardson acknowledged Wilson's statement with a subtle nod before continuing. "Given the complainant's withdrawal, this court hereby dismisses the criminal trespassing charge. However, the dismissal of these charges does not conclude our business here today." She removed her reading glasses, placing them deliberately on her bench. "Mr. Sullivan, this court finds itself in the unusual position of being able to address a larger injustice than the one initially presented in our docket." The courtroom remained silent as the judge consulted several documents before her. Patricia Martinez sat forward slightly, sensing the direction the proceedings were taking. Officer Chen maintained his position in the gallery, his presence a reminder of how this case had evolved from a routine arrest to something unprecedented. "As Chief Judge of this court," Judge Richardson continued, "I am implementing several immediate orders. First, I am directing the court's Veterans Services Coordinator to immediately process Mr. Sullivan's case for emergency housing assistance. A furnished apartment has already been secured through the Veterans Housing Initiative, available for immediate occupancy." She paused, making a notation in her files. "This arrangement will transition to permanent housing once Mr. Sullivan's veterans' benefits are properly reinstated." The judge lifted another document. "Second, I am ordering the immediate expedition of Mr. Sullivan's pending benefits appeals. I have here confirmation from the regional VA office that his case has been flagged for priority review, with an expected resolution within 72 hours. She directed her attention to Martinez. "Ms. Martinez, your office will oversee this process to ensure no further delays occur." Sullivan stood at attention, his military bearing maintaining his dignity even as the magnitude of these changes threatened to overwhelm him. The young journalist typed rapidly, understanding that she was witnessing something extraordinary in the normally routine proceedings of a county courthouse. "Third," the judge continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "I am establishing, effective immediately, the Lieutenant James Cooper Veterans Advocacy Program within this court's jurisdiction. This program will identify veterans facing similar circumstances and intervene before they reach the point of crisis that brought Mr. Sullivan before us today." She paused, allowing the significance of this announcement to register. "The program will be funded through a combination of state grants and private donations, several of which have already been pledged this morning." Judge Richardson stood, another break from normal protocol that emphasized the exceptional nature of these proceedings. "Mr. Sullivan, your appearance in this courtroom today has illuminated a failure in our system, a failure to honor our commitments to those who have served. However, it has also provided us with an opportunity to begin correcting that failure. She stepped down from her bench, approaching the defendant's table. Your actions 30 years ago brought my brother home and provided our family with closure. Today, inadvertently, you have given us another opportunity to serve justice in a broader sense. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she addressed the courtroom at large. This court hereby orders the establishment of a dedicated veterans docket, effective immediately. All cases involving veterans will be reviewed for potential diversion to support services before any criminal proceedings begin. We will not wait for another decorated veteran to face criminal charges before receiving the assistance they have earned through their service. As the formal proceedings concluded in Courtroom 3, an extraordinary transformation began to unfold. The usual swift dispersal following a court session gave way to something entirely different. The gallery, typically quick to empty, remained filled as people lingered, drawn to witness the conclusion of this remarkable morning. The atmosphere had shifted from judicial formality to one of shared purpose and community response. Patricia Martinez efficiently organized the immediate next steps, her legal pad now filled with action items and contact information. She conferred quietly with court officials, ensuring that every aspect of Judge Richardson's orders would be implemented without delay. The Veterans Housing Initiative representative, summoned during the proceedings, waited near the courtroom door with keys to Sullivan's new apartment and a folder containing essential documentation. Officer Chen approached Sullivan, no longer in his role as arresting officer, but as a fellow service member. "Sir," he began, extending his hand, "my father would be proud to know I played a small part in today's events. He always said we never leave anyone behind, in combat or at home." Sullivan grasped the offered hand, the simple gesture carrying the weight of shared understanding that transcended their earlier roles of officer and defendant. Mr. Wilson, the baker who had initiated the original complaint, made his way through the small crowd gathering around Sullivan. In his hands, he carried not his baker's cap, but a business card and a set of written instructions. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying genuine remorse and determination, "I've spoken with my staff. Starting tomorrow, we're implementing a new program at the bakery. Any veteran who needs a meal gets one, no questions asked. We're calling it the Cooper Memorial Breakfast Program." He paused, collecting himself. "You've taught us all something important today." The young journalist from the Portland Press-Herald approached Martinez, her laptop balanced carefully in one arm. "I'd like to follow this story as it develops," she explained. "Not just Mr. Sullivan's case, but the implementation of the new veterans programs. The public needs to understand both the problem and the solutions being proposed." Martinez nodded, recognizing the value of public awareness in maintaining momentum for the newly established initiatives. Judge Richardson had returned to her chambers briefly, but re-emerged with a sealed envelope bearing official markings. She made her way to where Sullivan stood, still maintaining his military bearing despite the emotional weight of the morning. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her judicial formality softened by personal connection, "this contains the official court orders we've discussed, but also something else. My niece, Lieutenant Cooper's daughter, is flying in from Washington tomorrow. She's bringing something that belongs to you." The court clerk, witnessing these developments, had already begun establishing a new filing system for the veterans' docket. Her computer screen displayed a partially completed template for tracking cases that might qualify for the new program. 30 years of administrative experience told her that this would transform how their court system operated, and she was determined to ensure its success. Sarah, the young baker's apprentice, who had shown Sullivan kindness during his time behind the bakery, had arrived during the proceedings. She stood near the back of the courtroom, still wearing her flour-dusted apron, having rushed over when she heard what was happening. Now she moved forward, carrying a small package. "These are for everyone," she said, opening the box to reveal still warm pastries. "Mr. Sullivan, you'll never have to wait in the alley for leftover bread again." The Veterans Housing Initiative representative finally stepped forward, sensing the right moment had arrived. "Mr. Sullivan, if you're ready, we can proceed to your new residence. Everything has been prepared according to Judge Richardson's orders." He held out the keys, the metal catching the late morning sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows. "Your new home awaits." Sullivan looked at the keys, then at the group of people surrounding him. The judge who had transformed his arrest into redemption, the officer who had seen him as more than just another homeless veteran, the lawyer who had helped tell his story, the baker who had moved from complaint to compassion, and all the others who now stood ready to ensure he never fell through society's cracks again. The moment crystallized the transformation from isolation to community, from invisibility to recognition, from despair to hope. It represented not just one veteran's journey from the streets to stability, but a community's awakening to its responsibilities toward those who had served. The courtroom, typically a place of judgment, had become a catalyst for change, demonstrating how justice, when properly administered, could heal rather than punish, unite rather than divide. The Portland Press-Herald's initial online article titled "From Streets to Justice, Decorated Veteran's Story Transforms Local Court" appeared just hours after the proceedings concluded. The young journalist, Rachel Bennett, had crafted a compelling narrative that captured both the personal drama and broader societal implications of Sullivan's case. Within hours, the story began generating unprecedented engagement across social media platforms and news outlets. The article opened with a powerful description of the morning's events. In an extraordinary turn of events at the Cumberland County Courthouse, what began as a routine trespassing case evolved into a moment of profound recognition and systemic change. Thomas Sullivan, a decorated Navy veteran who had been sleeping in an alley behind a local bakery, stood before Judge Eleanor Richardson, expecting judgment. Instead, he found understanding, recognition, and a community ready to make amends for years of oversight. Local television stations dispatched reporters to cover the developing story. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Martinez addressed a growing crowd of journalists, carefully explaining the broader implications of Judge Richardson's ruling. "Today marks a significant shift in how our justice system approaches cases involving veterans," she explained, her professional demeanor underscoring the gravity of the changes. The establishment of the Lieutenant James Cooper Veterans Advocacy Program represents more than just assistance for one veteran. It creates a framework for identifying and supporting others who have served our country. The story's reach extended beyond local media. National news organizations began picking up the narrative, recognizing its relevance to ongoing discussions about veterans' affairs and social justice. The image of a decorated war hero forced to sell his Navy Cross for basic necessities struck a chord with readers across the country. Social media amplified the story's impact, with veterans organizations sharing it widely and calling for similar programs in other jurisdictions. Officer Chen found himself being interviewed about his role in the events. "Sometimes doing our job means looking beyond the immediate situation," he explained to a television reporter. "When I processed Mr. Sullivan's arrest, I saw something in his bearing, his dignity under difficult circumstances, that made me dig deeper. The system worked this time because people took the time to look past the surface." Mr. Wilson's Bakery became an unexpected focal point for community response. The Cooper Memorial Breakfast Program, initially conceived as a simple gesture of reconciliation, began attracting attention from other local businesses. By evening, a dozen other establishments had contacted Wilson about implementing similar initiatives. The bakery's windows displayed a newly printed sign, "Veterans Always Welcome," in honor of Lieutenant James Cooper and Thomas Sullivan. Sarah, the baker's apprentice, found herself explaining to customers throughout the day how her small acts of kindness had been part of a larger story. "I just saw someone who needed help and did what I could," she told a local reporter. Maybe that's all any of us need to do, see the person, not the circumstance. Her simple philosophy resonated with readers and viewers, prompting discussions about individual responsibility in addressing social issues. The Veterans Housing Initiative reported receiving an unprecedented surge in offers of support. Property owners contacted the organization, offering apartments and homes for veterans in need. Corporate donors pledged funding for expanded services. Local contractors volunteered to help renovate and maintain properties designated for veteran housing. Judge Richardson's establishment of a dedicated veterans docket attracted attention from legal professionals nationwide. By late afternoon, her office had received inquiries from courts in several states requesting information about implementing similar programs. The American Bar Association expressed interest in developing guidelines for establishing veterans advocacy programs based on the Cooper model. Lieutenant Cooper's daughter, Naval Lieutenant Sarah Cooper, released a statement through the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. "My father's sacrifice brought together two families, his own and the brave man who brought him home. Today, that connection has created an opportunity to help other veterans who need our support. This is how we honor those who serve, not just with medals and memorials, but with meaningful action when they need us most." As evening approached, the Portland Press-Herald published an extended online feature examining the broader implications of the day's events. The article included statistics about veteran homelessness, explanations of the challenges facing returning service members, and details about how the new Cooper program would address these issues. Reader comments flooded in, many sharing similar stories of veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The story's impact continued to grow through social media sharing and online discussions. Veterans began sharing their own experiences, creating a digital tapestry of similar stories that highlighted the systemic nature of the problems Judge Richardson's ruling had addressed. Hashtags like Justin Cooper Program and Just Sullivan Effect started trending, creating virtual communities of support and advocacy. 1 week after the transformative court session, the Portland City Council chambers were filled to capacity for a special ceremony. The mahogany-paneled room, typically reserved for municipal governance, had been transformed for an occasion that brought together military officials, civic leaders, and community members. Thomas Sullivan, now wearing a newly tailored suit provided by a local veterans organization, sat in the front row alongside Judge Eleanor Richardson and Lieutenant Sarah Cooper, who had flown in from Washington. D.C. Mayor Elizabeth Chen, Officer Chen's aunt, as it happened, opened the proceedings with measured dignity. "We gather today not only to honor an individual's service and sacrifice, but to formally establish programs that will ensure no veteran in our community faces the challenges Mr. Sullivan endured." Her words carried the weight of official proclamation while acknowledging the personal nature of the occasion. The ceremony began with the formal presentation of Sullivan's replacement Navy Cross. Vice Admiral James Harrison, commander of the Naval Surface Force Atlantic, had traveled from Norfolk to oversee the presentation. "The Navy Cross," he explained to the assembled crowd, "is our nation's second highest military decoration. It represents extraordinary heroism in combat. Today, we not only replace a medal that circumstances forced a hero to surrender, but we reaffirm our commitment to supporting those who have served." Lieutenant Sarah Cooper stepped forward, carrying 2 velvet boxes. The first contained the original Navy Cross, repurchased from the Boston Collector. The second held the official replacement medal. Her voice steady, despite the emotion of the moment, she addressed Sullivan directly. Mr. Sullivan, 30 years ago, you brought my father home, allowing our family to honor his sacrifice properly. Today, we return something that should never have left your possession." As she pinned both medals to Sullivan's lapel, the chamber fell silent. The moment represented more than the return of military decorations. It symbolized the restoration of dignity and recognition. Sullivan stood at attention, his bearing as precise as it had been during his service years, though tears rolled freely down his cheeks. The ceremony continued, with Mayor Chen signing an executive order establishing the Portland Veterans Support Initiative, a comprehensive program incorporating Judge Richardson's court reforms and expanding them throughout city services. The initiative included priority housing assistance, job placement services, and healthcare coordination for veterans in need. Mr. Wilson, representing the local business community, announced the formation of the Portland Veterans Business Alliance. "What began as a simple breakfast program in my bakery has grown into a city-wide commitment," he explained. "Over 100 local businesses have joined our alliance, pledging support ranging from employment opportunities to direct assistance for veterans in need." Patricia Martinez, speaking on behalf of the Veterans Legal Advocacy Group, detailed the expansion of legal services under the new initiative. "We've established a permanent office within the courthouse," she announced. "Every veteran facing legal challenges will have immediate access to advocacy and support services. The Cooper program ensures that no case will be processed without first evaluating the availability of veteran-specific assistance and alternatives." The ceremony reached its emotional peak when Sullivan himself was invited to speak. Standing at the podium with military precision, he addressed the gathered audience with characteristic humility. 30 years ago, I did what any service member would do. I brought a fallen brother home. Today, this community has done the same for me. The programs being established here aren't about one veteran or one story. They're about fulfilling our collective promise to those who serve. Governor Margaret Williams, who had arrived midway through the ceremony, took the podium to announce that the state legislature would be considering a bill to implement similar programs statewide. The Cooper-Sullivan Veterans Support Act will ensure that the changes initiated in Portland become standard practice throughout Maine, she declared. Furthermore, we are already in discussions with other state governments about creating a regional support network. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a planned memorial to be installed in front of the courthouse. The design, incorporating elements of both military service and civic responsibility, would serve as a permanent reminder of the community's commitment to its veterans. The memorial would include an eternal flame and a simple inscription, "No one left behind, in honor of those who serve." As the formal proceedings ended, the gathering transformed into an impromptu community celebration. Veterans in attendance shared stories and connected with support services. Business leaders networked with program coordinators to establish employment pathways. Legal professionals consulted with advocacy groups about implementing the new court procedures. Sullivan, still adjusting to his role as the catalyst for these changes, found himself surrounded by people eager to share their own stories or offer support. Yet, amid the celebration, he maintained the quiet dignity that had carried him through years of hardship. His new medals caught the light as he spoke with fellow veterans, their presence representing not just his past heroism, but the community's renewed commitment to those who serve. 6 months after the transformative morning in Courtroom 3, Thomas Sullivan stood at the podium in the Portland Veterans Resource Center, addressing a group of newly arrived veterans seeking assistance. The center, housed in a renovated historical building downtown, represented the physical manifestation of the changes his story had inspired. Through the tall windows behind him, morning sunlight illuminated the space where dozens of veterans gathered, each seeking the support that Sullivan had once desperately needed. "When I stood in that courtroom half a year ago," Sullivan began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had never left him, "I was invisible. Today, thanks to the efforts of countless individuals and organizations, no veteran in our community needs to feel that way again." He gestured to the resource center's various service stations, where staff members assisted veterans with everything from housing applications to job placements. The Cooper program, as it had come to be known throughout Maine, had already processed over 300 cases, connecting veterans with essential services before their situations could deteriorate to the point of crisis. Judge Richardson's Veterans Docket had become a model for jurisdictions across the country, with representatives from 28 states visiting Portland to study its implementation. Mr. Wilson's Bakery had evolved into something of a community hub. The Cooper Memorial Breakfast Program had expanded far beyond its initial scope, now serving as a connecting point between veterans and support services. The walls of his establishment displayed photographs of military service members alongside information about available resources. The alley where Sullivan had once sought shelter now housed a covered seating area, specifically designed to welcome those in need of rest and sustenance. Sarah, the baker's apprentice, whose small acts of kindness had been part of the story's beginning, had established a mentorship program connecting local businesses with veteran employees. Her initiative had resulted in over 50 job placements, demonstrating how individual compassion could evolve into systemic change. Officer Chen had been promoted to lead the police department's new Veterans Outreach Unit, a specialized team trained to identify and assist veterans in crisis. His approach, emphasizing support over enforcement, had significantly reduced arrests among the veteran population while increasing connections to vital services. The Portland Press-Herald's Rachel Bennett had won a regional journalism award for her coverage of Sullivan's story and its aftermath. Her ongoing series about veteran reintegration had sparked similar reporting nationwide, contributing to a broader dialogue about society's obligations to its service members. Lieutenant Sarah Cooper had become a regular visitor to Portland, working with the program named in honor of her father. Her military duties now included liaising with veteran support initiatives, helping to bridge the gap between active service and civilian life. The photograph of Lieutenant James Cooper in the courthouse had been joined by a new installation, a wall of success stories showing veterans who had found their way back from the brink through the program's intervention. Patricia Martinez's Veterans Legal Advocacy Group had expanded its operations to 3 additional cities, with plans for further growth. The organization had successfully advocated for policy changes at the state and federal level, reducing bureaucratic barriers to veteran services and benefits. Standing in his new apartment, Sullivan could see the eternal flame of the courthouse memorial through his window. The flame served as a constant reminder of both sacrifice and renewal, its steady light representing the community's unwavering commitment to its veterans. His Navy crosses, both the original and its replacement, occupied a place of honor on his wall, no longer symbols of past glory, but active reminders of the obligation to serve others. The Cooper-Sullivan Veterans Support Act had passed the state legislature unanimously, establishing Maine as a leader in veteran care and support. Similar legislation was pending in 12 other states, each building upon the foundation laid in Portland. The Sullivan effect, as some had begun calling it, demonstrated how a single case could catalyze broad systemic change when met with compassion and commitment. Perhaps most significantly, the rate of veteran homelessness in Portland had decreased by 60% in just 6 months. Each person helped represented not just a statistical improvement, but a life restored, a future reclaimed, a promise kept. The model of integrated support services, from legal advocacy to housing assistance to employment programs, had proven that comprehensive intervention could create lasting change. As Sullivan concluded his morning address at the Resource Center, he shared the philosophy that had emerged from his experience. The true measure of a society lies not in how it treats its most privileged members, but in how it supports those who have given everything in its service. Today, we stand as proof that change is possible, that no veteran needs to stand alone, and that it's never too late to fulfill our promises to those who serve. The legacy of that winter morning in Courtroom 3 continued to grow, touching lives far beyond Portland's boundaries. What had begun as a simple trespassing case had evolved into a movement, demonstrating how justice, when tempered with compassion and understanding, could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Thomas Sullivan's story had become more than a tale of personal redemption. It had become a blueprint for systemic change, a reminder that every person's dignity deserves protection, and a testament to the enduring power of recognition and respect. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.